Sorry for the recent delay, that was due to a lack of ideas. Anyway, recently I watched Whemplar's video about making invisible jets. Basically, he used the latest hue block, I think. It was like a special type of light block that could change its color. Basically, using that, he used it to match the skybox so that it was quote-unquote invisible. That's good and all, but I have a few issues with his design. The biggest one by far being automation. When you're in a dogfight or piloting RC missiles in a jet from far away, or really doing anything in a jet, you won't have the brain power, especially in any combat situation, to also tune your lights to actually be invisible relative to the terrain. Frankly, it's just not really viable. So what if I did try to make it automatic? And not just automatic like, oh, if the bottom side is always this color, the top side's always this color. No. I decided to be a little bit more deranged this time and instead match not only the bottom color, the top color, but also a middle color for the transition period, but also do it in a more advanced way so that I could position it more precisely. A lot of small details, probably they don't actually affect the performance, but just to show to myself that I can, in fact, do this. So, the first and most important part of this entire concept is the test setup. Because by God, I'm not going to tune it when it's on an actual plane. Whenever you're doing your own forms of testing, production, and experimental designs, always remember to have small testing prototypes. Trust me, it's not worth making a massive project and then realizing that one of the core underlying principles will take forever to make or prove or make functional due to the size of it. It's just not worth it. So this was my setup. Had a little cube, so, that's what I used to register all the sides. Because I was using a cube during the testing setup, and the angle of all the panels mattered, I ended up having to make the final plane also extremely blocky. Costs and benefits, I could have added more panels. That would have required more angle sensors with more complexity. Not worth it. So for the first version, just had angle sensor for the top panel. So this is a little weird thing that I found on Danger Zone. So if you look at the horizon, below the horizon, it is light blue. Roughly from the horizon, 10 degrees up, there's a transition zone, and then past those 10 degrees, like 15 degrees or whatever, past that, it's the deep sky blue. So that's the weird thing. That transition period isn't exactly, the middle of it isn't exactly on the horizon. The edge of it is on the horizon, which means I have to offset the middle area a little bit upwards. So that's why instead of using one or two angle sensors, I instead have to use two, but like offset weirdly. I will say the new logic gates are quite useful because if you look at them, they allow you to do stuff like this. So where only using 3 logic gates, I can determine when both are on for one logic gate, that's just an AND gate. When neither are on, which is using the new logic gate, which wasn't really as easily an option before, and when only one of them is on and the other is off, which is also in the game before. Just being able to complete that set with the new logic gate really helps smooth these logic gate systems out and make them a lot more efficient. So the way that I detect the transition point is by having both these angle sensors at being slightly off from each other. What this does is makes their gap, makes them a small gap where one is off and the other is on whenever transitioning from both on to both off. And by tuning the 2 angle sensors, I can pick where I want that zone to be. And in fact, because the way I have them set up with a bit more logic, I can actually detect which side is in the transition zone. I don't need that, but it is an option. And because that transition zone is slightly above being perfectly symmetrical, I can't do the side ones using the same two angle sensors, which is why you'll see the amount of angle sensors I use is a lot bigger than it actually has to be. Anyway, so I get the top panel working, make a version where the bottom panel is working, where it's just the top one but the colors are flipped. That's the next set of 3 logic gates. By the way, gotta say, I kind of hate how the accumulator is implemented because it's good and I know I will adapt to it and the system is fine and functional. But also, if I have one accumulator, which is, say, producing an output of 16.5, and I want it to only produce that output when there's another signal sent, what I would have liked to do is to just run it through an AND gate. However, when I do run it through an AND gate, it reverts that signal of 16.5 to the nearest valid signal that a logic gate can output, which would be the number 1. It would just be so much easier if logic gates could also, in this update, produce signals up to 100, because then I don't have to go through a whole weird roundabout way of triggering the accumulator, triggering it the other way to remove that value when it's not being triggered anymore. Also, it turns out that I may be dumb, but I spent way too long trying to get accumulators to work because I thought that the hue panels functioned on a scale from 1 to 100 rather from 0 to 1, because it turns out that hue panels function on use decimal points to pick the value that they are. Anyway, minor mistakes aside, mistakes aside, I used a whole bunch of angle sensors to get the sides functional as well. Then yeah, that was pretty much it. After that, I just did the same thing with the other sides, added a few other things with the version 5, and then it was just mounting it onto a plane. So yeah, as you could see from the top, it matches the water line. From below. What am I saying? From above, it matches the water below. From below, it matches the sky above, and it automatically shifts as it rolls and whatnot to match the skybox. Using this system and using even more angle sensors, I could even in the future designate zones that I could want different colors. For example, I can keep expanding the system and keep adding more and more angle sensors to, say, make it so that the side that's facing the sun is always going to be bright white, because, you know, it would match the sun. Or I could even designate the clouds as their own sections, using compasses instead to choose what area of the skybox it needs to be. Ultimately, as Whemplar has discovered himself, the amount of complexity needed to get these systems functional is frankly insane, because it turns out that covering something in 1 by 1 by 1 blocks takes a lot of complexity. But there is a chance that it might somewhat be useful. While it is true that air and space combat are the two places where you regularly engage in combat and can move very high distances, and therefore out of locking range. And when you're out of locking range is a specific time this type of camo would be most useful. However, on ground combat, you also end up fighting at relatively decent distances. With name tags off, I know some ground combat people regularly fight at 500 meters, as opposed to locking range, which is only 300 meters. This means that visual camouflage would be useful in ground combat under some scenarios. As for automating it, I do have some ideas, but frankly, they are just as ridiculous and completely impractical. The reason why I suggest ground combat is because in ground combat, you don't need to use light panels on the bottom. You only really need to use light panels on the top sides and the sides. But even then, it's a lot more simplistic because you can only be looked at from so many angles as opposed to being in the air where enemies can come from any direction. Now, to automate the ground camouflage, that would be even more complicated than automating aircraft camouflage. But It would technically be possible using a system like inertial navigation. Basically, before GPSs were commonly used, inertial navigation was the common method for finding where you were in the world. Basically, it combined two things. One, using something like a speed sensor, it detects your speed, and two, it knows in what direction you're moving using something like a compass. Both of those blocks are in the game. Using these two things, you can figure out based off where you started, how long have you been moving in a direction to then figure out your new position. Have that system constantly looping, and over time errors will build up, but it will always give you at least a rough approximation of where you are in the world. Combine that with a memory system to remember what sections of the map are what color, and you could probably, within reason, have an automatic system which camouflages your tank or whatever. But instead, this system takes a lot more complexity and is also nightmarishly difficult to build, which is why I have not built it. So there's that. And that's about it. If you do have suggestions, please tell me them because I am running out of ideas.